Chapter 15, $2 for adults and 50 cents for children. "Chuck," said David after a little, "we made it, didn't we? Mission accomplished." "Golly, yes, mission accomplished," repeated Chuck with quiet satisfaction, and they went through the complicated motions of a secret handshake that they had. "But it's kind of lonesome without Mrs. Pennyfeather. I got used to having her on my lap on the way here. She was a nice hen. She didn't give any trouble or anything." "Yes," sighed David, "she was an awfully good hen. I'll miss her a lot. She was such a comfortable sort of bird, not stuck up and temperamental like John. I hope we did the right thing leaving her there, but what else could we have done?" "Not a thing. Don't begin worrying, not before you have to. We can't go back. Besides, you wouldn't want to, that is, to get her. What would the mushroom people do without her? Say, do you know a funny thing, Dave?" "Well, sort of. You mean about Mr. Bass running after us to be sure we took a mascot?" Chuck nodded, and he narrowed up his eyes. "I just don't understand it. Do you suppose he knew somehow? But how did he guess we'd take a hen of all things, the one creature we'd have to have? He didn't even know you had a hen." But now David frowned and stared off through the window, started to speak, and then was silent again. Finally he made up his mind. "The only thing that bothers me, we should have taken John and the children." At this, Chuck began frowning as well, and you could see that he too was beginning to think it would have been a much more satisfactory business if only John and the young chickens had been brought with them. After all, Mrs. Pennyfeather might be lonely and begin to pine, and then who could tell what kind of weather Basidium might have and what disastrous effects on the next crop of sulfur plants. Still, on Basidium, where time passed quickly, the time of new growth would soon be round again. "Well," he said after a bit, "how could we have managed all that chicken feed, Dave? We couldn't have. We just about busted our buttons getting that one sack into the ship." Dave nodded gravely. "I know, I've thought of that. All the same, it just seems like..." Then he turned to Chuck and grinned. "It just seems like there's only one answer. We've got to go back." Chuck's eyes widened and then he slapped his knee. "But why not, Dave? Why not? What's there to stop us from going every night if we like? What's to stop us from going at midnight one night, skipping a night, and then going back home at 4 o'clock the morning after? Staying 26 hours instead of 2. Or a week, as long as we started back at exactly 4 in the morning, like Mr. Bassett said." This was so staggering an idea that for a minute or two David couldn't answer. "Why not?" he breathed. "Why not? And maybe take Captain Tom and Mr. Bass, and then my mother and father, and yours too when they get back from their trip. Then Captain Tom would know you weren't telling a whopper, and if he did think that, of course, we couldn't take them all at once. The ship's too small. I think we should bring Mr. Bass first. Oh, absolutely Mr. Bass first, with Captain Tom, then the rest. That way we could take the chickens along too, because we'd have plenty of people to help with the sacks of feed." "Hooray!" shouted Chuck, and he looked as if he'd jumped up and down and hadn't been strapped to his seat. "That'll be a lot more stupendous than this trip's been." But at that, David shook his head. "Not for me it won't," he said firmly. "Nothing could be more stupendous than this trip, because this was the first. There'll never be another like this." "Well, anyway," said Chuck airily, "what's to stop us from taking anyone? I mean, after we've shown our families around over Basidium and we've given them a nice little taste of space travel, what's to stop us from taking 1 or 2 scientists along? Jet experts and important astronomers and geologists and all like that." At these words, the strangest thing happened to David. At first, right after Chuck had spoken, he felt tremendously excited. Yes, just thinking, making some grown-up's eyes bulge with wonder at all he and Chuck had to show, some astronomer who would have sworn the only satellite of the Earth was the moon. Think of getting the better of all those grown-ups who always said that nobody would ever land on the moon. Think of that. And yet, the odd part was that, after his first thrill of excitement, he didn't like to think of taking just anyone. It made him feel horribly depressed and unhappy to think of a whole lot of outsiders tramping over Basidium, frightening those gentle little people who were so much like children. Like children, that is, except Ta, who was not like a child at all, and who could have faced anyone on Earth, David felt, without flickering an eyelash. No, he didn't want to tell the world about Basidium, for he knew, deep down inside, that he didn't want to run the risk of causing any change there. Those people were happy, except during times when nature acted up and made heat waves. There were no automobiles, no clanging stop-and-go signals, no factories, nor roaring trains. There were no wars, and he did not want to be the cause of making it possible for there to be one. The Basidiumites had their own ways. What if he and Chuck changed all that and the mushroom people were no longer happy, no longer contented with what they had? The idea was so terrible to him that he gave Chuck a shudder. Then he looked at Chuck, who was waiting for him to answer, because after all, it had been he, David, who had started all this, the wonderful flight to the mushroom planet. "No, Chuck," said David after a second or two, in which all this had raced through his head. "No. I think it'd be awful to tell the people about Basidium, and just to take anybody there. How do we know what they'd want to do? Why, I bet they'd start geological expeditions there, and Basidium would get all dug up. Then after a while there'd be sightseeing tours, then hot dog stands, and then there'd be pop bottles and paper bags thrown around. And those poor little Basidiumites would be stared at, and the people would poke at them and point to them and try to get in their houses and maybe want to take some of them back to Earth to put on the exhibition, and Ta would be angry and hate us. Why, just think, shouted David, getting more and more worked up as he imagined how it would all turn out. It'd be terrible. Can't you see we've got to keep it a secret? Chuck looked as if he'd been squashed flat, but after a while he sighed. I guess you're right, he said finally. It would be awful. I mean, thinking about Basidium the way it is now, so quiet and peaceful. Of course, I like the hot dogs and soda pop and ball games and sightseeing and all like that. But Ta would have a fit. No, I guess we can't tell people. But how about Grandpop and your folks? You mean we can't even take them? I don't see why not. I think they'd understand. Still, maybe it's up to Mr. Bass. Yes, I think really it's up to him. We've got to take him just as soon as possible, along with John and the other chickens and some more feed. Then we'll ask him. So the matter was settled, at least to David's satisfaction, but you could see how Chuck still longed for sightseeing tours to Basidium, with tickets $2 for adults and 50 cents for children. Now the boys were quiet for a little, thinking, each to himself, how strange it would be to reach home again, to walk once more upon their own Earth, a planet teeming with such complicated affairs as the little Basidiumites could never dream of. Then David, thinking of home, suddenly gave a quick, sidelong, rather guilty glance at Chuck. Chuck, he began in a peculiar voice, Chuck, there's something I forgot to tell you. Did you listen to the radio last night? Nope, I didn't. Too busy getting out my winter clothes. Well, the newscaster was giving out storm warnings. Chuck turned slowly and studied David. Giving out storm warnings for when? He demanded in an ominous tone. Now calm down, Chuck, it's nothing. We may even be home before it breaks. He just said it had hit early this morning sometime, and he was warning the fishermen to put out extra anchors and chain. Chuck was silent for a bit, then he slowly shook his head. I don't get it, he said. I don't get it at all. If Mr. Bass knows so many other things, how come he didn't know? Oh, who's worrying now? Interrupted David just a little too quickly. You always call me the old worrier. What I say is, Mr. Bass told us not to doubt. He promised us that everything would turn out all right. So let's take it easy, Chuck, and just not worry about getting home safe. Mr. Bass wouldn't have sent us if he'd thought we were going to run into danger. I say we're going to be all right. We've come this far, haven't we? We've accomplished our mission, haven't we? Yep, agreed Chuck, seeming to take heart a little. That's so, and then we're going so fast for the storm that it won't last very long. He thought for a bit, and then he laughed softly to himself. You know, he said, I just can't wait to see Grandpop's face when we tell him all that's happened. And your mom's face, too. If she thought this was all going to be a dream. But at this minute, Chuck had to give an enormous yawn, so big he looked as if he'd never get his mouth closed again. Then he rubbed his watering eyes. Yes, thought David, speaking of dreams, he himself was beginning to feel pretty drowsy. What with the smoothness of the ship's motion and the monotonous little peeping of the oxygen urn, and what with not getting all his sleep and then having so many adventures and climbing up to the place of the hidden water and back down again and having to think so hard, he was about done. He yawned hugely. Aye, yeah, are you woozy, Chuck? But there was no answer, for Chuck's head had fallen forward on his chest and he was fast asleep. Well, David said to himself, guess I'd better check my controls again just to be sure. But he was about to reach into his pocket and get out his wallet when it occurred to him that it would be too much trouble to check them all over again. He knew they were right. He was absolutely sure. And he thought he'd close his eyes for just a moment to see how good it would feel. Awfully good. Awfully good. Chapter 16. Into the Storm. The watch on Chuck's wrists had ticked away for an hour and 3/4, and Mr. Bass's remarkable little mechanism had shut off the rocket motor and turned the ship tail down toward the earth in a free fall before the boys opened their eyes again. In a few minutes they would be home. They stretched, and when they looked up, they gasped, for what a wonder met their eyes. Directly above them pulsed the crowding billion suns of the Milky Way, but never had the boys seen such a Milky Way as this. A broad, majestic cloud of light that reached across the sky from one side to the other, and so beautiful and seemingly so close that they held their breaths to watch. It's like a tremendous river of suns, said David to himself. And he tried to think of how those crowding suns are part of the galaxy in which we live in our tiny solar system, and that there are other galaxies, other vast clusters of thousands of millions of sun out beyond our own. But it was too much to hold in his mind. The marvel of that luminous arc overhead, set with its great constellations, was enough. After a little, the boys looked down. There beneath them, nearer and nearer, loomed the earth, but such an earth as they had never dreamed of. Such an earth as no other boys, except in their dreams perhaps, had ever seen in the history of mankind. It hung in space, appearing to them from this distance, for now they were only a few thousand miles away, a gigantic glowing globe. And just as David's father had said on that evening when he first read Mr. Bass's little green notice in the paper, they could see both the night and the day at once. On the side of the earth where the sun was shining, it was day. Drifts of cloud shone glaring white as they reflected the sun. The polar cap, too, was dazzling, so dazzling that the boys could scarcely look at it with their naked eyes. Extending up from the polar cap was a great gray and brown and green continent that stretched toward them, cradled in a brilliant blue sea. And on the night side of the world the little cities twinkled in tiny groups like nests of diamonds, while all around the earth's curve lay the deep, deep black of space. The sun's rays could never light that, for there was nothing in it, no dust, no gas, nothing which could reflect the light. Far, far off swam the sun, a blazing ball surrounded by its flaming corona, and so terrible in its brilliance, uncurtained by the earth's atmosphere, that they could not look at it at all. On the opposite side of the sky, still in sight, hung the round, silvery, shining orb of the moon. Like a plummet, their ship was dropping toward the earth, straight into that zone of dawned gray which was their own slim segment of western hemisphere. As the earth swung up closer and they came into the last layers of the earth's atmosphere, there now began to sweep toward them long gusts of wind like eager, sinewy fingers. Only a short distance of their journey remained, it being now precisely 4 minutes before 6 o'clock. Then, just as David turned on the rocket motor to lessen the blow of their landing, the ship suddenly gave a tremendous lurch. A flash of lightning ripped the dark sky, and the thunder let out its warning voice, high up, crackling, hesitant, then gaining in speed and deepening, until at last it rolled upon them, enveloped them, and they were lost in it, and its mighty reverberations seemed to split open the very heavens themselves. Wildly the ship was flung about in the wind, and all at once, like pellets of steel, hail and sleet were dashed against its sides. Now the constellations were blotted out, and the wind and the thunder bellowed together. Forks of lightning sprang at them, and in the intervals of its brilliance they could see how the clouds were boiling and surging on all sides. But the most fearsome thing of all was the quivering of the spaceship. It roared as though all of its force was being pitched against an even greater force, the terrible, rushing wind. It seemed to fight and struggle, and when the wind lessened, on it went, only to start bucking and lurching again. "I'm scared, Chuck," cried out David. "So am I. We're being swept off our course. If we ever get down, we're going to land bang in the middle of the ocean. We'll never make it, Dave. Mr. Bass was wrong. He should never have sent us." But at the mention of Mr. Bass, David determined to get a hold of himself. What was the use of being scared, he asked himself sternly. The only thing to do was to try and keep the ship on its course, to keep it on the beam the best he could. "What time is it, Chuck?" he shouted. "6. We're not making time, not by a long shot." "Hey there, Mr. Bass," called out David as a kind of feeble joke, though he could scarcely hear his own voice in the uproar. "We're almost home. Keep an eye on us, will you?" But the only answer was the crash of thunder and the crackle of lightning, like a tough piece of silk being savagely ripped in two. Hail beat against the window as though it were determined to shatter it, to crack it to bits, and just then David decided that, Mr. Bass or no Mr. Bass, it was hard not to be afraid. "Flashlight, Chuck," he yelled, "on the instrument panel." Chuck flashed his beam, and David saw with a plunging heart how the needles were being dashed drunkenly from side to side. He tried, after struggling with his pocket flap and his wallet, at last getting out Mr. Bass's paper so to set the controls correctly again, but it seemed quite hopeless. "We can't make it, Chuck. It's no use." But now, it seemed to them, the darkness began to lessen a little. All about them the clouds were becoming a dull gray. The hail and sleet fell off, and the thunder rolled away like a giant's bowling balls, banging and slamming against one another farther and farther down the sky. Beneath them, as the clouds parted here and there for an instant, they caught glimpses of a gray expanse of ocean, then a dark shoreline of jagged wooded rock. Now even the wind seemed to be giving up its battle, and slowly David felt the knots of fear in his stomach begin to relax. "It's 2 minutes after 6, Dave," Chuck announced presently in an exhausted voice. "I guess we're going to make it. Either the storm's over or we've beaten it home. Or maybe it's taken a detour. Just think, we're going to make it, Dave. Mr. Bass was right." Down they hurtled, tail first, into a bleak and windswept world. There lay the Monterey shoreline with its huddled cluster of homes, the fishing boats bobbing and dancing on the roughened waters, and dark patches of trees bending under the force of the gale. Away up the coast, storm clouds bore toward them, but beneath them lay the comforting, welcoming stretch of Captain Tom's beach. And there, could they be certain? But how their hearts leaped was not just a speck of the dark rock which they'd climbed off to get their upended ship for the blast-off, but another speck as well. Lonely and infinitely tiny, it looked on that gray stretch of sand. And did it move? Was there a signal given as though an ant had waved its antenna? The shoreline drew closer and seemed to expand, and the speck grew into the little figure of a living being. Dave, it's Mr. Bass. He's come down to welcome us. We're home. And that's the end of chapter 16.